The dollar is safe. That's what every financial news anchor, every Treasury official, every mainstream economist keeps telling you. But while they've been repeating that mantra, six central banks just quietly dumped $1.2 trillion in US Treasury holdings over the past 18 months. Not speculation, not theory, hard data from the Federal Reserve's own reports. And if you think this is just routine portfolio rebalancing, you're missing the most significant monetary shift since the collapse of Bretton Woods. I'm going to show you exactly what's happening behind closed doors at central banks in Beijing, Tokyo, Riyadh, and three other capitals that are systematically dismantling dollar dominance. And here's the part that should terrify anyone holding significant dollar-denominated assets. This isn't a coordinated attack. It's something far more dangerous, independent, rational actors, all reaching the same conclusion simultaneously. My opinion? We're watching the slow motion end of the dollar's monopoly, and the people who see it coming will be positioned differently than those who don't. Let me break this down using what I call the three pillars of de-dollarization framework, because once you understand these three forces, everything from oil pricing to your retirement account starts making uncomfortable sense. Here's what the conventional narrative gets wrong. Mainstream analysts look at the dollar's 59% share of global foreign exchange reserves and say, see, still dominant, but that number was 73% in 2001. We've lost 14 percentage points of global reserve share in 2 decades, and the decline is accelerating. In just the last 3 years, that share dropped from 61% to 59%. That's the same rate of decline in 3 years that took a decade previously. Let me show you the numbers that matter. The first pillar is what I call strategic reserve diversification, and it's happening faster than any official wants to admit. China's central bank officially holds 3,245 tons of gold as of March 2024, but here's what nobody tells you, that's only what they're reporting. When I spoke with a former People's Bank of China advisor last year in Hong Kong, he told me off the record the actual number is probably double that. We don't report purchases through state banks and sovereign wealth funds. Whether that's true or not, here's what we can verify. China has been a net buyer of gold for 17 consecutive months as of April 2024, adding roughly 225 tons to official reserves during that period. But gold is just the visible part. China reduced its US Treasury holdings from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to $797 billion as of January 2024. That's a $503 billion reduction. Japan, traditionally America's most reliable treasury buyer, dropped from $1.32 trillion in 2021 to $1.08 trillion in early 2024. That's $240 billion gone. Saudi Arabia's holdings down from $184 billion to $111 billion since 2020. That's a $73 billion exit from a country that's recycled petrodollars into treasuries for nearly 50 years under an unofficial agreement. Add in Belgium, a known holding location for Chinese reserves, Switzerland, and the Cayman Islands, and you get to that $1.2 trillion figure. These aren't marginal adjustments. This is structural repositioning. Here's my doubt about the official narrative. If the dollar is so safe, why are the central banks with the most sophisticated analysis capabilities all moving in the same direction at the same time? Now, let me show you what they're buying instead, because this reveals the actual strategy. It's not just gold. China is stockpiling commodities at unprecedented levels. Copper reserves up 247% since 2020. Strategic petroleum reserves rebuilt to 950 million barrels. Rare earth processing capacity expanded by 180%. They're converting dollars into physical assets that hold value regardless of currency fluctuations. But here's the part that connects to something even bigger. This is just pillar one. The second pillar isn't about what central banks are selling. It's about what they're building to replace the dollar system entirely. And this infrastructure is already operational in ways most Americans don't realize. Stay with me, because what comes next explains why this process is already irreversible. So here's the second pillar at work, and this one operates completely differently. I call it alternative payment infrastructure, and it's the reason why even if central banks stopped selling treasuries tomorrow, the dollar's dominance would still be eroding. Most people think international payments still flow through SWIFT, denominated in dollars, cleared through New York banks. That was true 5 years ago. It's becoming less true every single day. Let me show you what's actually happening. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, processed 97.6 trillion yuan in transactions in 2023. That's roughly $13.7 trillion equivalent. Now compare that to 2018 when CIPS processed just 26.5 trillion yuan. That's a 268% increase in 5 years. This isn't experimental anymore. This is infrastructure handling real volume. But here's what makes this genuinely threatening to dollar dominance. CIPS now connects to 1,394 financial institutions across 109 countries. When I was in Singapore last year talking to treasury managers at a major Southeast Asian bank, one told me candidly, "We maintain dollar clearing relationships because we have to. We're building yuan clearing capacity because we want optionality. In 5 years, we might not need New York for half our transaction flow." My prediction, within 7 years, at least 30% of global trade settlement will bypass dollar clearing entirely. That doesn't kill the dollar, but it breaks the monopoly that gives America unilateral sanctions power. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works in practice, because this illustrates why the shift is accelerating. Russia and India conducted $65 billion worth of trade in 2023. Almost none of it settled in dollars. They're using rupees, rubles, and increasingly yuan as an intermediate currency. Russia sells oil to India, receives payment in rupees, holds those rupees in Indian banks, then uses them to buy Indian pharmaceuticals, machinery, and agricultural products. The dollar never touches the transaction. Saudi Arabia, and this is the one that should make every treasury official nervous, just joined the mBridge project in June 2024. This is a digital currency platform connecting the central banks of China, Thailand, the UAE, and now Saudi Arabia, designed specifically for cross-border wholesale payments that bypass SWIFT entirely. Think about what that means. The country that has priced oil exclusively in dollars since 1974, that recycled petrodollars into US Treasuries for 5 decades as part of an explicit security arrangement, is now building the technical capability to settle oil transactions in digital yuan, digital dirhams, or digital rials. Here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. We weaponized the dollar payment system so aggressively after 2014 that we gave every other major economy a strategic imperative to build alternatives. When we froze Russia's $300 billion in central bank reserves in 2022, every finance minister and central bank governor on earth asked the same question: could that happen to us? The answer for China, Saudi Arabia, and dozens of other countries was, we need to make sure it can't. Here's what I genuinely question. Did American policymakers understand that freezing Russian reserves would accelerate de-dollarization by a decade? Because that's exactly what happened. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button, because we need to understand the scale of what's being built. The Bank for International Settlements reported that 134 countries representing 98% of global GDP are now exploring or piloting central bank digital currencies. Almost all of these systems are being designed with cross-border interoperability that doesn't require dollar conversion. The numbers tell you everything you need to know. In 2022, dollar share of SWIFT transactions was 42%. By late 2023, it dropped to 38.6%. That's a 3.4 percentage point drop in just over a year. Meanwhile, yuan-denominated SWIFT transactions grew from 1.9% to 4.7% in the same period. This connects to something even bigger, and I'll show you in a minute, because the third pillar isn't about replacing the dollar's functions. It's about creating an entirely new monetary ecosystem where the dollar becomes optional instead of essential. And once you see how advanced that ecosystem already is, the third pillar is what I call Commodity-Backed Trade Recalibration. And this is where theory meets physical reality in ways that can't be reversed by Federal Reserve policy or Treasury interventions. Here's what the mainstream gets wrong when they say the dollar is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. That's technically true, but here's what's really happening. Faith and credit mean nothing if you can't buy oil, copper, lithium, or wheat without using dollars. The dollar's true power never came from reserve status. It came from being the only efficient medium for buying the commodities that run modern civilization. That monopoly is breaking, and the specific mechanisms tell you everything about where this ends. In March 2023, China completed its first LNG transaction with France's Total Energies, settled entirely in yuan. Not a symbolic gesture, 91,000 tons of liquefied natural gas from the UAE, purchased by a Chinese company, paid for in yuan. The seller accepted yuan. The entire clearing process happened through Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange. But here's the number that should terrify dollar bulls. By the end of 2023, approximately 20% of China's LNG imports were being settled in yuan. That's up from essentially 0% in 2021. We're watching the petro-yuan become operational in real time. Saudi Arabia announced in 2023 that it's open to discussing yuan-denominated oil sales. They haven't officially transacted yet, at least not publicly, but the fact that they're even discussing it represents a seismic shift. This is the country that has priced oil exclusively in dollars for 49 years as part of the security arrangement that defined the petrodollar system. My opinion on what happens next: within 3 years, Saudi Arabia will conduct its first publicly acknowledged yuan-denominated oil sale to China. It won't replace dollar pricing immediately, but it establishes the precedent that oil can be priced in multiple currencies. Let me show you what this actually means in practice, because the implications cascade through the entire financial system. When oil is priced in dollars, every country needs dollar reserves to buy energy. Those dollar reserves are typically held in US Treasuries. That creates automatic demand for both dollars and US government debt. It's a self-reinforcing system that has funded American deficits for decades at artificially low interest rates. But if China can buy oil in yuan, Russia can buy machinery in rubles, and Saudi Arabia can accept payment in rials or dirhams, that automatic demand disappears. Countries still need reserves, but they can hold them in a diversified basket: gold, yuan, euros, commodities, futures, even Bitcoin. Here's the uncomfortable truth that makes people deeply uncomfortable. America's ability to run trillion-dollar deficits while maintaining low borrowing costs depends entirely on forced global demand for dollars and treasuries. Remove that forced demand and we face a choice: dramatically reduce deficit spending or accept significantly higher interest rates. Both options are politically toxic. Let me give you the specific numbers that matter. US government debt is currently $34.6 trillion. We're paying approximately $659 billion annually just in interest payments as of 2023. If Treasury yields increase by just 2 percentage points across the curve due to reduced foreign demand, that interest expense rises to over $1.3 trillion annually. That's more than we spend on defense, Medicare, or Social Security individually. Here's what I genuinely doubt. I don't think American policymakers have modeled what happens when foreign treasury demand drops by 30 to 40% over a decade. The fiscal math becomes impossible without either massive tax increases, spending cuts that would trigger social crisis, or monetary financing that risks serious inflation. When I spoke with a former IMF economist in Washington 6 months ago, he put it starkly: we're assuming continued foreign appetite for treasuries in our long-term budget models. If that assumption breaks, everything breaks. The commodity recalibration pillar isn't speculation anymore. It's already operational. The Shanghai Gold Exchange now trades more physical gold than London or New York. The yuan-denominated oil futures contract launched in 2018 now handles over 500,000 barrels per day in volume. Let me pull this together and show you why these three pillars create an irreversible process. So let me pull this together, because what we've just mapped isn't a temporary fluctuation. It's the systematic dismantling of a monetary order that has defined global finance for half a century. The $1.2 trillion treasury dump by 6 central banks is not the cause of dollar decline. It's the most visible symptom of a deeper, irreversible process I call the 3 pillars of de-dollarization. These pillars, strategic reserve diversification, alternative payment infrastructure, and commodity-backed trade recalibration, are not independent events. They are mutually reinforcing systems that create a new monetary reality where the dollar is no longer the mandatory, exclusive medium for global commerce. Once a country builds the capacity to settle trade in its own currency, it has less need to hold dollars. Once it holds fewer dollars, it has less need to price commodities in dollars. Once commodities are priced in multiple currencies, the dollar's monopoly on global energy and resource trade evaporates. My opinion, this isn't a conspiracy. It's rational, defensive strategy by nations that watched the dollar weaponization playbook and decided they needed insurance. The dollar is safe lie isn't being told by malicious actors. It's being repeated by people who are either unaware of the structural shifts or are psychologically invested in the old paradigm. Here's the uncomfortable truth that connects all 3 pillars. America's own policies accelerated this process. The 2014 and 2022 sanctions on Russia, the aggressive use of secondary sanctions, and the political brinksmanship over the debt ceiling all sent the same message to every other capital: your economic security depends on reducing your exposure to US financial systems. We taught the world that dollar dominance is a vulnerability, not a strength. Let me show you what this actually means for the next decade. Based on current trajectories, I see three plausible scenarios playing out simultaneously in different regions. Scenario 1, competitive coexistence, most likely for the next 5-7 years. In this scenario, the dollar remains the primary global reserve currency but loses its monopoly. We see a multi-currency system where the dollar, euro, and yuan each dominate different trade blocs. The US retains significant advantages in technology, finance, and military power, but its ability to run persistent current account deficits without consequence diminishes. Treasury yields gradually rise as foreign demand normalizes, forcing difficult fiscal choices. The dollar index stabilizes around 90-95 instead of its current 105, reflecting a more balanced global monetary system. Scenario 2, spheres of influence, accelerates if geopolitics worsen. If US-China tensions escalate into a new Cold War, we see rapid fragmentation. A US-led bloc, including Japan, UK, Canada, Australia, maintains dollar-centric trade. A China-led bloc, including Russia, Saudi Arabia, most of Asia and Africa, operates through yuan and commodity-backed systems. Countries are forced to choose sides, leading to separate technological, financial, and trade ecosystems. This scenario would trigger capital controls, asset seizures, and potentially a global recession as supply chains fracture. Scenario 3, systemic reset. The black swan. A major crisis, a US debt ceiling default, a collapse in treasury market liquidity, or a coordinated move by oil producers to price in a basket of currencies, triggers a rapid, disorderly shift. In this scenario, the dollar loses its reserve status faster than markets can adjust, leading to a sharp decline in the dollar index, potentially 30 to 40%, spiking import inflation, and a painful but necessary restructuring of the US economy. This is the scenario financial elites privately fear but publicly dismiss as impossible. Here's my prediction. We are currently moving from scenario 1 towards scenario 2. The $1.2 trillion dump isn't an anomaly. It's the opening chapter of a decade-long transition. The question isn't if the dollar's role will change, but how smoothly that change will occur. Now, here's what makes people uncomfortable. This shift isn't inherently bad for America. A more balanced global monetary system could force the US to address its structural deficits, rebuild domestic manufacturing, and compete on innovation rather than financial coercion. But the transition will be painful for anyone holding dollar-denominated assets without understanding the new reality. If this analysis changed how you see global finance, hit that subscribe button because we're going deep on the practical steps individuals and investors can take to navigate this transition. And drop a comment below, which scenario do you think is most likely and why? I read every single comment and will respond to the most thoughtful ones. The dollar is safe lie is being exposed in real time. The $1.2 trillion dump is just the beginning. The real question isn't what central banks are doing, it's what you are going to do when the monetary system you've known your entire life fundamentally changes. The game changed. The question is whether you're even playing anymore.